Some witches and wizards are respected, others are followed, but a rare few are avoided entirely, not because they demand it, but because others understand what might happen if they don't. Because fear in the wizarding world is not always obvious. It isn't just about what someone can do or the reputation they carry. More often, it's about uncertainty, the kind that makes people hesitate, reconsider, or choose not to act at all. And that hesitation matters, because when enough people begin to step back, to speak more carefully, to avoid direct confrontation, something changes. Not in the individual being feared, but in the world around them. Decisions shift, boundaries move, and influence begins to grow without needing to be forced. Which is what makes certain witches and wizards so difficult to measure. Not simply powerful, but unpredictable. Not always visible, but always accounted for. And once someone reaches that point, they are no longer just respected, they are avoided. And sometimes, that kind of presence is felt most strongly in the ones you understand the least. Number 5. Severus Snape. Severus Snape was never the most obvious presence in the room. He didn't raise his voice unnecessarily, he didn't draw attention without purpose, and he rarely explained more than he needed to, which is precisely what made him difficult to read. Because with Snape, certainty was never guaranteed. His ability as a wizard was clear from an early stage. Exceptionally skilled in potion making, known to refine complex methods, and even develop spells of his own, he operated at a level few could match. But ability alone does not create fear. Uncertainty does, and Snape existed in a space where intentions were rarely obvious, a teacher whose loyalty was often questioned, a skilled occlumens capable of concealing thought itself, a figure who could stand in one place while appearing to belong in another, which meant that even those who worked alongside him were never entirely sure where they stood. And that hesitation matters. Because when people begin to second-guess what someone might do, they change how they act around them. They speak more carefully. They reveal less. They avoid direct confrontation where possible. And over time, that behavior becomes consistent. Which is what makes Snape so significant in a list like this. Not because he demanded fear, but because he created an environment where it was easier to be cautious than to be certain. And in the wizarding world, that kind of presence is rarely ignored. Because when someone cannot be read, they cannot be predicted. And when they cannot be predicted, they are often avoided. And Snape was not the only witch or wizard whose presence carried that effect, because the next name on this list removed uncertainty entirely and replaced it with something far more immediate. Number 4. Bellatrix Lestrange. Bellatrix Lestrange does not leave room for uncertainty. Where others hesitate, she acts. From an early stage, her magical ability was undeniable. Precise, fast, capable. A witch capable of executing complex spellwork with confidence that few could match. But it is not her ability alone that made others step back. It is how she used it. Bellatrix did not approach situations with caution or calculation in the way others might expect. She removed the pause. The moment where most witches and wizards reconsider, measure the outcome, or decide whether to act at all. And without that hesitation, everything becomes more immediate, more difficult to predict, more difficult to contain, and far more difficult to oppose. Which is why her presence alone was often enough to change behavior, not because others lacked ability, but because they understood that Bellatrix would not slow down. She would not wait, she would not adjust, and she would not stop once she had begun, and that kind of momentum creates a different kind of fear. Not quiet, like Snape, not uncertain, like those who operate in secrecy, but direct. The kind that forces a decision immediately rather than allowing time to think. Which is why Bellatrix was never simply a powerful witch. She was a force others had to account for the moment she appeared, Because when hesitation disappears, so does the advantage of preparation. And yet, even that level of fear is still contained when compared to what comes next. Because the next figure on this list did not rely on unpredictability, he gave people a reason to be afraid before anything had even begun. Number 3. Gellert Grindelwald. Gellert Grindelwald did not rely on unpredictability. In many ways, he removed it entirely. Where others created fear through sudden action, Grindelwald created it through certainty, because his intentions were clear. He believed the wizarding world should not remain hidden, not remain separate, and not remain restrained by systems he viewed as limitations. And more importantly, he was willing to act on that belief. Not impulsively, not recklessly, but with structure, which made him far more difficult to oppose, because Grindelwald's power was not just in his ability as a wizard, though that alone placed him among the most formidable of his time. It was in his clarity, a defined vision of how the world should function and a willingness to bring that vision into reality. And when power is supported by conviction, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes direction, which is why his influence spread so far and so quickly, not through chaos, like Bellatrix, not through uncertainty, like Snape, but through momentum that others could see and understand, and, in many cases, could not stop. Because when someone knows exactly what they intend to do, hesitation shifts. It no longer belongs to them, it belongs to everyone else, and that is what made Grindelwald so feared. Not just for what he might do, but for what people realized he was already prepared to do next. Because once that level of certainty is established, opposing it becomes far more difficult. And yet, even that kind of fear has limits. Because the next name on this list did not create fear through vision, but through presence alone. What's interesting is that none of these witches and wizards needed to demand fear. They didn't announce it, they didn't explain it, and in most cases, they didn't even acknowledge it. Because fear in the wizarding world rarely comes from what someone says. It comes from what others believe they might do, and once that belief takes hold, behavior changes. People hesitate, they reconsider, they choose different words or avoid speaking at all, not because they've been told to, but because it feels safer that way. And that's when fear becomes something else entirely. Not a reaction, but a presence. One that exists before anything happens and lingers long after it's over. Which is what separates power from something far more difficult to challenge. Because the final 2 names on this list didn't just create fear in moments, they carried it with them wherever they went. And few figures embody that more completely than the next name on this list. Number 2. Tom Riddle. Tom Riddle was not always feared. In fact, at first, he was something else entirely. Intelligent, controlled, precise. A student who excelled, and a presence others noticed for all the expected reasons, which is what makes what followed so significant, because fear did not appear all at once. It built, gradually, deliberately, and without being fully understood until it was already there. The name he later chose changed everything, Voldemort, and with it came something different, not just power, but presence. Because Voldemort did not need to explain himself. He did not need to demonstrate what he was capable of, repeatedly or loudly. The understanding was already there, and that is what made him so difficult to oppose. Because by the time his influence was fully recognized, behavior had already changed around him. Conversations became quieter, decisions became slower, and hesitation became the safer option. Not because it was enforced, but because it was expected. Which is what separates fear from reputation. Reputation can be challenged, it can be questioned, it can be tested. But fear, once it settles, reshapes everything around it. And Voldemort understood that. Because his power was not just in what he could do, but in what others believed he might do next. And once that belief takes hold, it spreads, quietly, consistently, until it becomes part of the world itself. Which is why his presence was never limited to a single place or a single moment. It was carried in the decisions others made long before he arrived, and that is what made him so feared, not just as a wizard, but as a possibility others could not ignore. And yet, even that level of fear was not absolute, because there was one figure who others hesitated to stand against for entirely different reasons, and that difference matters. Number 1. Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore was never a figure defined by fear, not in the way others on this list were. He did not create uncertainty like Snape. He did not act without hesitation like Bellatrix, and he did not impose presence in the way Voldemort did. And yet, very few chose to stand directly against him, which raises a different kind of question. What does it mean to be feared without ever demanding it? Because Dumbledore's power was never hidden, his ability was widely recognized, his achievements were known, and his understanding of magic placed him in a position few could approach. But what set him apart was restraint. He did not act unnecessarily, he did not escalate situations without reason, and he did not rely on his reputation to control others, which meant that when he did choose to act, it carried weight. Because nothing about it felt impulsive, it felt considered, and that is where a different kind of fear begins. Not uncertainty, not chaos, not pressure, but understanding. The awareness that if it came to it, there would be very little room to respond. And that awareness changes behavior. It doesn't need to be spoken. It doesn't need to be enforced. It simply exists in the background. Which is why Dumbledore's presence created something few others could. Not fear of action, but hesitation before opposition. Because while others forced the wizarding world to react, Dumbledore made it pause. And that may be the most powerful position of all. Because when people hesitate before challenging you, you no longer need to prove anything at all. Perhaps that's the difference. Some witches and wizards are remembered for what they did, others for what people believed they might do. And once that belief takes hold, it changes everything. Not just decisions, but behavior. Not just moments, but entire outcomes. Which does leave one question. When you think about it, which witch or wizard would you least want to stand opposite? And who do you think people feared for the wrong reasons? Let me know what you think below. And if you find yourself drawn to the more curious corners of the wizarding world, you may want to stay a little longer. There's always more to uncover if you happen to be looking when the clock strikes odd.